In this video lesson, we'll learn what complex carbohydrates are and what their role in metabolism is. At the end of this video, you ought to be able to explain how starch and other complex carbohydrates are used for energy. In contrast to the simple sugars, some carbohydrates contain more than one sugar unit or building block. And when two simple sugars are bonded together, they form what we call a disaccharide, your first vocabulary word of today's video. When the glucose and the galactose join up, for example, this makes a disaccharide that we call lactose. And this is the sugar found in milk. You've probably heard of people who are lactose intolerant. Well, they're intolerant of a disaccharide, a glucose and a galactose bonded molecule. Now, much larger numbers of simple sugars might be joined together. Sometimes they'll have as many as 10,000. And in this case, the resulting carbohydrate is something we would call a polysaccharide. Of course, a disaccharide meaning two, and now a polysaccharide, which means many. Another word for a polysaccharide is a complex carbohydrate. Now, depending on how the simple sugars are bonded together, you might have polysaccharides functioning as sort of a time-release store of energy, or maybe as structural materials that may be completely indigestible by most animals. An example of this kind of a structural material is the polysaccharide called cellulose. This is really the primary component that plant cell walls are made out of. So just like simple sugars, a lot of disaccharides and polysaccharides are very important sources of fuel for our cells. And unlike simple sugars, disaccharides and polysaccharides have to undergo some preliminary processing before the energy can be released from their bonds. So let's take a look at what happens when we eat things like sucrose, which is common table sugar. So sucrose is really the main carbohydrate that we find in plant sap, and it's composed of two simple sugars, glucose and fructose, and they're linked together. To use sucrose, our bodies have to first break down the bonds that link the glucose and the fructose together. Once that's done, then the individual monosaccharides can be broken down into their component atoms, and the energy that was stored in their chemical bonds that held them together, that can now be harvested and used. In plants, we have a primary form of energy storage, and it's a complex carbohydrate called starch. And we find starch in the roots and other tissues of the plant, and you can see that in the image that's being displayed. So starch consists of basically 100 or more glucose molecules, and they're joined together in a chain or a line. When you think of grains like barley, wheat, and rye, they're all very high in starch content. And in fact, corn and rice are even more than 70% starch. And although it's composed of glucose molecules that are linked together, as we said, starch doesn't actually taste sweet. Because of its molecular shape, it just doesn't stimulate the sweetness receptors on our tongues. The glycogen, though, that stores energy in your muscles and liver, while it's also a complex carbohydrate, it's sometimes referred to as animal starch, even though it has a more branched structure than starch, and it carries more glucose units that are linked together. So here's the key thing that we're trying to figure out today. Now, many complex carbohydrates are like these time-release fuel pellets. The glucose molecules only become available very slowly, and they do so as the bonds between glucose units are broken. As a demonstration, you can take a piece of a potato or even a piece of bread, take a bite of that, and let it rest on your tongue. Initially, it doesn't actually taste sweet, but after a few minutes, you will actually begin to taste some sweetness as the chemicals in your saliva actually break the starch down into a glucose. The relative amounts of complex carbohydrates and simple sugars that we find in foods causes them to have these different effects when we eat them. Oatmeal and other things like rice and pasta are rich in complex carbohydrates. But fresh fruits, on the other hand, they're rich in simple sugars like fructose. Consequently, most fruit will give a quick burst of energy as the sugars are almost immediately available because they're so simple. They're not bonded together in long chains and stuck together with other molecules. So in those cases, the fuel will soon be gone from the bloodstream as well. That's the other thing. So simple sugars in the oatmeal will become available only gradually because more complex carbohydrates, like those of the oats, get broken down into their simple sugar components first before they can then be broken down even further to be used as energy. So it takes a longer amount of time in order to convert complex carbohydrates into the simple sugars that can be used very quickly.